Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining our event tonight, Onwards and Onward, under discussion, not under discussion, I'm sorry, Poets on Poetry, presented by University of Michigan Press. I'm Haley Winkle. I'm an associate editor here at the Press, and I'm really excited to be working with Derek Pollard on our series called Poets on Poetry. We will be watching for audience questions throughout the event. On Zoom, please submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom center of the screen. You can turn captions on or off using the captions button in Zoom at the bottom right side of the screen. We'll be recording the event this evening and we'll post it on our YouTube channel later this week. A little bit about our speakers tonight. We have Derek Pollard, who currently serves as our Poets on Poetry series editor at the University of Michigan Press. He's a widely published poet and book critic, as well as a longtime educator, workshop leader, and founder of Constellar Creative, a creative agency that specializes in content marketing and copywriting. We also have Jane Miller, who is a poet and essayist. She lives in Tucson, Arizona, with artist Valentina Grenier. She is the author of 2 books in the Poets on Poetry series: Working Time, Essays on Poetry, Culture, and Travel, published in 1992. And more recently, From the Valley of Bronze Camels, a primer, some lectures, and a boondoggle on poetry, published in 2022. And I have it right here. All right. And we have a series of questions tonight to talk about Jane's work as in her series, or in our series. So Derek, please take it away.
Haley, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity always to sit down and talk about the work that we're doing at the Press, but more importantly than that, the work that really fuels the Press. And I think, Jane, your work is an excellent example of that. And I love the fact I have this thing for symmetry, and I think it's really interesting. We were talking before we went live, and maybe we want to get back to this. The importance of having Paul Klee's painting on the cover of this book. But I love the fact that the Press first published your work in 1992, and then it was exactly 30 years later that we had the good fortune to bring out From the Valley of Bronze Camels. And so I just want to mention that there's so many synchronicities like that. We're not going to have enough time to get to all of them. Having said that, I do want to, before we get into our conversation, just make mention of the fact that this is a difficult day in our country's history. It was a historic day based on what happened today in New York City. It has been a historic day since the tragic events that occurred in 1968. And I want to make mention of that because one of the reasons why this series and the other series, Haley, you mentioned one of them, Under Discussion, and also Writers on Writing, were founded, was to connect poetry, writing, and the arts to the larger conversations that are taking place in terms of politics, in terms of race, in terms of identity, in terms of equity and equality in this country. And so, not that I want to lead with one of our heavier questions, but Jane, this has been something that really has been at the center of your work, both as an essayist, as a critic, as a poet. This notion of a close, abiding attention, and the ways in which literature and the arts, the ways in which poetry actually has a place in these conversations. And I'm just kind of curious to hear more from you about whether or not poetry does in fact make something happen.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for working on the book because they made it happen. Just publicly to acknowledge how great everyone everyone on staff just really came through for me and made it easy to publish a book. And thank you. To your question, yeah, these are dark times. And it's not surprising that poets respond to dark times. That's a big part of what we do. For those who are listening and who are writers, you know that poetry happens in slow time. You know, it's a little bit like the slow food movement that started in Italy, where you know, even if you're making a very simple soup like onion soup or leek soup, you would take your time. You would not just throw it together. Even if you had 4 other things to do and 6 kids to take care of, you would put it on simmer. You would be smelling it. You would deal with it. And it happens even in the most humble ways, most humble households, if one is paying attention. And I think that poetry also occurs in that kind of slow time, and it advocates against the dilution of complexity. That's something that we need desperately in these times, when there's gaming, there are various pornographies, such as the political pornography that we're living through. There are news bites, the kind of simplification, oversimplification of, to use your word, Derek, you used earlier, the facts, the truth. And poets always have had a responsibility to speak to that deepest place that people share, where they know that something is real and that something happened. In my book, I mentioned Ziggy Marley's beautiful song, "You Don't Know the Past, You Don't Know the Future." The title of that album is Conscious Party. And while it's a beautiful reggae song, it reminds me of the task that poets have to make conscious reality, and to advocate for it, to witness what is going on, to very slowly take in all aspects of what is going on, and to report. We exist in a very subterranean way. We don't have any money involved in what we do, and so we're free, unless we are, as has happened in other regimes in Russia and in China, we are jailed. That hasn't happened here yet, directly, although we see it indirectly when artists are incarcerated, for various and sundry non-poetic acts. So I don't know whether that addresses the full range of what I could say about the artist in the world and the responsibility of the artist in the world. I'll just add this. I used to think that the function of the artist was to transform sorrow. And that seemed like a really important thing to do, that there was so much grief in the world, and that if we could only, make light for people. But I think we have a deeper responsibility, not only to make light, but to make real what is going on. And yeah, I would say that's why we need poetry, maybe more than ever, but certainly now.
Well, and I just very briefly want to follow that up, because one of the other things that we were talking about before the webinar began was the impetus that Donald Hall, the founder of the series, felt to make poetry public and to incentivize conversations around the art of poetry, so that it wasn't something that simply was occupying a very clearly delineated and fairly quiet space. And I really appreciate the ways in which both of your books take up that project by inviting the reader into the process. In fact, there's a point in one of the chapters in From the Valley of Bronze Camels where you address that very directly. You talk about the ways in which the reader is implicated in these processes through the very act of reading. And I know, Haley, this is kind of segueing into one of the questions that we had been discussing earlier, but I think that that's such an interesting opportunity for us to spend a little more time talking about that relationship, because not only is poetry public, not only is it intimate, but it's also dialogic, right? And it does both implicate and energize the reader as well as the writer. So I don't want to steal your thunder, Haley. If you'd like to weigh in, I would love to hear the question.
I'll let you take it away, Derek. I think you're just on a roll.
If we're talking about that relationship, and this is, again, I think this is something we're kind of anticipating as we're going. Um, but my role largely is to function as a reader in this process, right? From an editorial perspective, that's what I do. And I can't tell you the joy it brings. It's an incredible honor to read the work that comes over the transom or that we wind up seeking out and requesting. But I'm really, really interested when you make a claim like that, right? And it's a claim that shows up elsewhere, both in your essays and in your poetry. How do you see that relationship? The relationship between reader and writer, and where do you find yourself when you're writing an essay like Figs and Fiddlesticks in Politics, for instance? How does that relationship wind up making meaning in the work that you're doing?
Well, I like to be controversial, and I like to stir up some trouble. So I think it behooves me to think in ways that will be confrontational and will interest a reader to balk or to agree in part and to think, why is this true or not true? So I take on controversial subjects for myself mostly. I mean, I think initially it's a selfish act. You know, I think about what interests me, what annoys me, what do I need to learn? And then I try to explore that. And I don't think I'm different. I mean, I think many artists work this way, where you work blindly. You just kind of find your way into a subject, and eventually that will piss somebody off. You know, someone will disagree, and that's great. You know, that's why we push each other forward. Why we all move forward when we try to figure out. For example, there was a big controversy many years ago about what was the position of the I, you know, the capital I, in poetry. Should it be shoved out? You know, do we really care that your mother beat you with a wooden spoon? Okay, well, that's so sad. That's terrible. It's horrible. But is that a subject for art, or is that something private, or for your psychologist, or, you know, what is the place of the self in poetry? You know, I took up the question because it really interested me and challenged me, and I wanted it to have the same effect on other readers. Poetry is, and writing about poetry is essentially an inquisition, the good kind. You know, where you're asking, what's going on in this poem, or what do I think belongs in a poem, or what is a poem? So honestly, what begins as a selfish act, private and confusing, one muddles through as a writer, and eventually some sharp, hopefully some sharp idea comes out, and that if it's sharp, it could hurt someone in that intellectual way. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, it's so interesting to me. So one of the books that was recently published in the Writers on Writing series is a book by Brenda Miller, in which she talks about the formative process of writing, right? What the essay involves the writer investing in. And it's so interesting to me because there's such a dance of the intellect taking place in your essays, right? That it's almost hard for me to believe that there's a certain formlessness from which they take their form, right? They're not didactic in that I don't feel as though I'm being led. And I think that that's a real skill. And it requires, and this again is, we're talking about the relationship between reader and writer, one of the great acts of trust on the part of both parties, right? To trust your reader enough to not necessarily draw the lines between the points in the constellation, right? But it's fascinating to me that you start from such formlessness, right? Because it's such a close attention. It's such an engaging process, but you seem to have found a way to have it happen on the page in a way that seems self-evident, that it sounds to me, as we're talking about, actually requires a fair amount of and you had said this at the start, slowness, right? Not just close, careful attention, but slowness in order for the ideas to take on that sharpness, that tang, that friction that's going to make them resonate with a reader, particularly a skeptical reader, right? And so, not that I'm asking you to try to explain the inexplicable, but I am fascinated by the permission that you have given yourself so consistently, particularly in a society and culture that seems productivized, to take the time and to have the writing reflect that in ways that are so evident to a reader who is able to pay attention.
Some of you may know Linda Gregg's work, and she the poet Linda Gregg, who has at the front of one of her books the phrase, "It was like being alive twice."
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's kind of what the process of writing is like, whether I'm writing poems or writing essays, or just basically answering the question. One is alive in life and hopefully responding to life sensually and sensorially, and also thinking intellectually about reality, which is a process of art. And where they meet really interests me. I don't want to get too far from life and I'm not a scholar, or a researcher in that sense. So if I get too far into philosophy or ideas, I really get lost. And I'm sure a reader could tell that. On the other hand, I like to think about these things as a living, working writer who makes poems. What kind of poem will the thinking about it lead me to?
So this is a point that has long fueled my own interest and curiosity about poetry, which I, as a writer, have found myself following more than trying to lead, the more that I have done it over the course of my life, and if we will call it, but my writing career, right? That notion of not only trusting the reader, but of trusting myself to allow the ideas to coalesce and take shape, and also to feel both comfortable and confident to know that they're not always going to make sense. And I think that that's another one of the things that you do so well. And that's one of the great continuities between these two books, right? For those of you who haven't read either or both of them, or if it's been a minute, I really encourage you to take the books up together because they're in such interesting conversation, right? But a trust also that the ideas that drive the work that we do don't have to be transparent to us in the moment of making, which seems, again, a really, really difficult concept that over the course of the chapters in both of your books comes into clear focus.
Well, Chet Baker's song, "Let's Get Lost," that's one of my principles for how to write. I really like to get lost, and I jump around a lot. Something reminds me of something, which reminds me of something. Also, if you wanted to speak for a moment about the two books, the earlier one was written while traveling, literally, written on my knees, like on a train, or in a borrowed house on the road, and the other written basically in one room. And I think that also affected how slow I was working. Obviously, if you're traveling literally in a moving train, your mind will be different from the mind that is, sitting on a yoga mat. Yeah. And I haven't even begun to figure out, what I prefer, or, I don't think you can control that sort of thing. Writing just happens. And the world sort of encases you in itself, wherever you happen to be. But I think the books are different because of where they were written and how they were written. And of course, they're 30 years apart. But, I recognize so many of the same things that I was saying, maybe hopefully better as I got a little bit older and could think things through more clearly. But I mean, I would know they were written by the same person. I don't know if anybody else would know that.
Well, I think so. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about this is I think you can set them side by side. You can read them. There's such an interesting play at work. And I think that that's another very important point is, and I mean this in the most serious sense, there's such a tremendous sense of play, intellectual play, the sort of elasticity of the permission to wander in those ways. I can't help but think of Thoreau's essay Walking in relation to that process of that sort of, it's such a strange way of putting it, but that sort of calculated aimlessness, right? Like I am going to go walk with no destination in mind. It's just so interesting to me. I keep coming back to it, but it's that permission that we give ourselves, and not just as poets, but as people, right? And goodness gracious, I'm not sure if we can necessarily untie those two, but it's just so interesting to me that over the course of those 30 years between the two books, you've allowed yourself to wander. And at the same time, that's brought such clarity, right? You're able to follow the aimlessness in your prose because of the ways in which the lyricism that's so present in your poetry shows up. And that also is not easy to do, because I think that quite often when poets are attempting to write in prose, if they're not scholars, right, and they're not accustomed to that discipline and that practice, those two things don't work as seamlessly as they do in your writing. And I just wonder, thinking about this and thinking about it out loud, do you find yourself drawing on not only some of the same impetus, but also some of the same ways of going about thinking and writing when you're writing an essay, or when you're thinking about sequencing essays for a book that you do when you're writing poems?
Oh, they're very similar processes. And I think of the essays as poetic in the sense that I do think of the music of the sentences. Obviously, it's not as tight as in a poem where you might even be counting syllables, or you might even be using rhyme. So prose doesn't have those qualities, but it should have music, in my opinion. I mean, I read what I've written out loud many times, and listen to, what I can change, how I can alter the lines to make them more musical, because I think that's how people will take them in. Mm-hmm. But both processes have to do with being in the present. I write about what I'm interested in right then and there. For example, the first essay started just because I was also writing a book of poems which included questions, and it ended up being in the title of the book. It's called "Who is Trixie the Trasher and Other Questions," and that ended up being my leitmotif through that book of poems, where I was asking in the poems, whether at the end of the poem or somewhere hidden in the middle or in the title, questions that interested me. And so I ended up writing the first essay, "May I Ask a Question?" And thinking about, when is the question mark used in poetry? Poetry is essentially an interrogative, an art form that interrogates. And so it was easy to jump from point to point once I had point A. And just, I guess the next essay I wrote had to do with a piece of music that someone sent. So, it's never the same.
Yeah. Well, in speaking to that, you in Tucson area, so one of the titles in one of your essays is Javelina Stink, right? And I think that say again.
And they do.
Yes, they do.
I could open up my door. Maybe there were a couple out there. They're usually out there at this time of late afternoon.
But also interesting, because that's another essay in which you interrogate the art of poetry and talk about some of the things that we don't talk about when we talk about poetry. And it kind of gets back to the ways in which you're conceiving of the poet, of poetry, of writing about poems and poetry as being that constructive provocation that leads to deeper conversations and dialogue, right? And this is where I think we really do an injustice to Auden when we don't continue the line in which we get the quote, "Poetry makes nothing happen," right? Because that poem goes on to say so much more about what poetry does in fact make happen and why there are cases in which it is silenced. But I wonder if there's anything from that chapter that you'd like to share about the ways in which we ourselves at times conscript poetry to fit into containers that we've created, containers like the canon, for instance.
Well, you know, we are here as listeners. We listen to music. We're here as viewers. We watch movies. For those of us who are interested in poetry and those who are trying to get interested in poetry, the most important thing is to acknowledge where we are in the present. And so if we are in a difficult time and there's poetry being written that is silly, and has no real meaning to be silly. In other words, it's not being used because it's a stand-in for something that can't be said. If it's frivolous, you know, that's a problem. And I find it in my own work. That's how I am able to criticize it in others, because, you know, I'm just as at fault as anyone else for being glib, you know, writing too easily about something that I really haven't thought about because it sounds good. You know, you can easily fall in love with the music of poetry and not realize what are you actually trying to say as a writer, or what are you trying to communicate to a reader? And so I was attacking, you know, frivolous surrealism, and I was attacking identity politics in poetry where it's just self-serving. And, you know, it is confusing. I think it's easy to come out against something, but I hope that I was able to present both sides of the argument, because particularly for identity politics in poetry, you know, if you're really serious about representing your own group, which is a, you know, necessary correction for all the times when many groups were not recognized, where does that end up? You know, if you're a Canadian, can you never write about Puerto Rico? You know, so it's one of many dilemmas that it befalls us as writers, as artists who are using language as a medium. You know, we have such a responsibility because it's such an old form.
Well, and it's, I mean, I find myself in other capacities using the very language that we hear repeated so often in our lives. Use your words, right? And there's such importance attached to that, because it's not just articulation that we're talking about here. As you say, it's representation, it's opening up conversation, it's daring to wade into fraught territory. And we started this evening's conversation marking a tragic anniversary in this country's history. I appreciate the ways in which you're talking about the role that poetry plays in inviting us to think more deeply about the ways in which we lean into language, both intentionally and unintentionally, so that we can really think about the ways that we're communicating with one another, the opportunities we have and the opportunities we miss to build fellowship and coalition. And it certainly is central to the mission of the press and this series to make sure that voices are heard and this platform is as inclusive as possible, as meaningfully as possible. And I really, really appreciate the caveat and the acknowledgement that you've made that gets really complicated really quickly, and that in those instances in which we err, because we're going to, because language is thorny, and quite often, as you say, as we're moving from idea to idea, as we're moving from shifting ground to firm ground, there are going to be moments where we get lost. And I think we have opportunities at events like these, at readings, at conferences, whenever we gather together and celebrate art that is centered around language, we have a chance to begin to spark some significant and lasting change. But it's always going to be complicated. We're going to make mistakes, and the conversation is going to be a fraught conversation. I think that's one of the things that we're committed to being a part of at the press and with the series, is to create a space in which that conversation can take place. And we have the opportunity to create relationships between readers and writers. And I think your book does an excellent job of extending that invitation and acknowledging that the work that we do is thorny and complicated work because it's human work. And I'd be really, really interested. I know we have a bunch of questions that we've come up with, but one of the things that happens in one of the chapters, do you want me to write a poem from the Valley of Bronze Camels, is you move. We're speaking about this sort of inclusivity and these invitations. You move from talking about John Ashbery to Dennis Smith to Rainer Maria Rilke. I'm really interested in the ways in which the canon and canonicity come into play for you, because this is, again, one of those areas that I think you've really led the conversation over the years. So I'd be really curious to hear more about it.
Thank you, Derek, for all your comments. We each have to make our own canon. There's no question about it. The universities have not done a good job. Maybe they're under duress and can't, but they're not doing well. You know, for me, Sappho is as alive as Adrienne Rich. They speak to me. They are part of my canon. And I think as a teacher, certainly, and as an essayist, it's my responsibility to let people know that that is not only possible, it's necessary. Because if you're told who to read, that's you know, immediately a turnoff. I just try to present who I love and to liberate other people to make a canon that is, you know, involves different cultures. I love Latin American poetry. I was highly influenced as a younger writer by the poetry of Europe. You know, and then I've just, it's like a giant weaving, you know, you just put in whatever threads you want, and you make your quilt, you make your, and then you know, you sleep with it. It's an intimate process, and why not trust yourself? You know, just because someone says you need to love Milton, you know, I don't read Milton. I don't like Milton. Sorry, John. You know, I just think there are important poets that will get lost if we are allowed to just follow our leaders. That's always a bad thing. I don't want to lead anybody except maybe by the example that I love what I love and I love who I love. You know, life and art are really close together. I think if you have a way of being in the world and you have built some ethical sensibility into yourself, that should also affect how you are as an artist and what you make and how you think as a student of the art of poetry and of literature in general, and in fact of any study. So I've tried to live in such a way through my mistakes. God knows, I've got, you know, tornado behind me, but I've tried to learn from them and apply what I've learned in my life from my work. And as a teacher, that's what I've got. That's all I've got. And I hope it's, you know, I hope it's been good enough. I've had a long career in university workshops and seminars, and I've tried to make that clear to people that if they're looking to me to tell them who to love, that's you know, I never wanted that, and I never will want that. I don't know whether that speaks to your question, but I feel free to say that's how I wrote my book. You know, I just, whatever I loved, I put in, and what, you know, Rilke is in certain circles passé now. People think of him as effete, and there he is in his castle that he was given, and cruel to women, and he's sort of out of favor now. And yet he has spoken to me in many of his poems, and so I can't deny that. The truth is complicated, and we as poets advocate for the largest possible vision, which might include some ugly stuff about a poet. I don't think that he should be erased in any sense. And why not speak of him in the same breath with Ashbery, because they speak to me, and that I gave myself license to say that out loud.
Well, and again, that's such an important point, because so many of these are important points. The intimate relationship between who we are and what we do, right? The inextricability of our existence as writers and as people. The complexities that we face in contending with the realities of personal history. I'm with you. I deeply distrust anyone who has the temerity to say they live without regret. I don't understand how that's possible in our human world. And I'm with you. Lord knows I got a lot of regrets. But I too have tried to learn, and I think that that's one of the key takeaways here, is that we're given that opportunity to err, to reflect, and to learn. And one of the things that I'm hearing is that poetry is one of the ways in which we can invite that type of reflection, because it dislocates us from communicative day-to-day language. Hi, how are you? Poetry, when it is reaching us, when we are available to it, requires us to read differently, which requires us to think differently, which requires us to be in the world differently. And as complicated as that gets, and I'm at a point in my life where I'm realizing a lot of the writers that I admired when I myself was just beginning the trajectory that I have pursued as a poet, I wouldn't have wanted to sit down. I wouldn't even have wanted to be in the same room as some of them, as people. But Rilke's elegies, they're absolutely gorgeous poems, as difficult as some of them are. And that makes it really challenging for us, because there are a lot of reasons in which Rilke should be interrogated for the decisions that he made and the privilege he enjoyed and his mistreatment, right, that he visited upon others.
You got me thinking, not just about Rilke, but so many writers who didn't live exemplary lives. Picasso comes to mind immediately.
Yep.
What do we do with these people? What do we do with the parts of ourselves that are imperfect? I think we just have to have a critical sensibility and an open mind and be able to discuss these things freely. As I said, I don't think he should be erased. I was thinking of one of the things that Sappho wrote, just a little strophe that we have so little of her work. All is to be dared.
Yeah.
Obviously in translation, but Rilke certainly, and other writers who could be ostracized now, but he dared to have a breakthrough. Having a breakthrough in consciousness in the arts is one of the most difficult things you can develop as an art and as an artist, but it's very hard. It's a lot easier to just repeat and repeat what you do over and over, but to really develop requires breakthroughs in consciousness, and he certainly had one when he wrote when he wrote his elegies. And I still think they're viable and rich and profound, really.
Well, in this, that may well be one of the opportunities that the new criticism has left us, right? Despite the fact that we've moved away from it, and you want to talk about a challenging group of gents. that was, I mean, just controversy left and right everywhere you look there. But the notion that we can focus our critical attention so close to the page, right, and so close to the poem might give us the opportunity to visit texts that might otherwise be taboo or too difficult for us to fit. And like you said, it's just, this gets really, really complicated. And
poetry is difficult. I mean, I think that's its nature, and it mirrors life. I think it's fair for people to disregard certain writers if they want to. I know there are,
I do too.
whole cadres of people who just, they wouldn't read Rilke if their life depended on it, and that's fine with me. We were talking earlier about the canon. I think people have to come to terms, with who their icons are, and to be honest, and to have to knock those icons down and break the stone, when necessary. And I've gone through periods, just to use Rilke again, when I just thought, I'm not going to read this stuff anymore.
Yeah.
I'm just not into it. And he's cruel, and I want to slap him. But, I come back around. I mean, one could think about other icons, like Eliot, like Pound. Boy, that's a whole other conversation about what's wrong there. And yet they have had a profound influence on contemporary poetry. There's no getting around that.
I think that that's absolutely true. And again, as difficult as it is to try to fit all of this together, there are just moments in the history of the art where change happens. And it just so happened, I look to Eliot, for instance, and the four quartets are absolutely extraordinary poems, right? If we are able to focus on them as poems, for me as a writer and as a poet, they're extraordinary.
Right now I'm a Stevens fan, so I guess they are set against each other only as regards their very music of their lines. We forget about even what they're trying to say. The very music of their lines has had, Wallace Stevens has had more of an influence on my own writing.
Yeah.
But how to say this? Lyric poetry, which is the basis of all poetry, the sounds that one makes and the feeling that comes out of those sounds, that enters not only the reader's body, but has come from the writer's body and is alive. Lyric poetry, shows up in many different ways. It can show up in a kind of narrative poem. It can show up in a poem that is just philosophical. It can show up in a poem that is trying to make statements. But if that's there, if the relationship to feeling and to the sensuousness of life is there through the sounds, almost any poetry will work. So really the allegiance is not to an idea or to a people, but to a feeling that is actually generated from an emotion that one feels in one's body. And that's how I, in the end, adjudicate what I love and what I would recommend, and what I disdain.
Well, and this brings up such an interesting point, because this also, you had mentioned that one of the great debates, and it seems from a perspective outside of the poetry communities, and I want to be very careful about pluralizing that, right? Because this is one of the cool things about where we're at and where we're going, is that there are so many poetries here in the United States and around the world. And I just want to acknowledge and celebrate that fact. Because again, that is our pathway to establishing canonicity, is finding the voices that resonate most deeply. But you talked earlier about the debate about the place and the position of the lyric I in the poem. And so you're talking about, again, the sort of the musicality, the play of language, the tactility. It makes me wonder about the legacy that has been left to us and how this fits into the work of, say, the language school, for instance, right? Which really attempted to excise lyricism from the poem and wound up leading to a poetry like that of say, Kenneth Goldsmith's. Does that, and again, it's going to be different for everyone, but I'm just curious because we have the great good fortune to be speaking with you. How does that fit in to the ways in which you conceive of canonicity and of poetry, right? What place does that have in this conversation?
Well, every movement or every gesture is open to interpretation. You know, eventually language poets, I think, themselves started to leave the movement because it wore itself out. You know, it was a corrective to self-centered confessional poetry, poets that only talked about their own personal lives, that whined a little, that were sentimental. You know, they fell into a lot of bad habits that the language poets just sort of cleared up. And it was very refreshing until it wasn't, until it became vague and detached from feeling. And slowly, I guess you'd say the next movement was the postmodernist movement, which, you know, started beginning of the 20th century, but is still on. It's still a thing where that eye had to be balanced with a more neutral setting that didn't seem so preoccupied with one's own, you know, navel gazing. So yeah, I think the language poets, people like Lynn Haginian, I mean, so important. Ron Silliman, but you know, a lot of those poets, they survive because they're so lyrical. That's what language poets retained about the subjective eye. That was what lyricism was typically used for.
Well, and I'm thinking about Silliman's the new sentence, right, which I think is an excellent example of that cleaving to the sort of, and I think that's one of the overlooked facets of that particular movement. I think you could say the same thing about the Dada movement, right? Is that there was a profound sense of art and artifice, right? Getting into the etymology in both of those movements, because they were directed at the ways in which we were using language, the ways in which we were using cultural spaces, right? I think about the Cabaret Voltaire, right? In which poetry became an environment, not just an experience, or excuse me, it became an experience, an environment, and not just a sort of individualized or personalized activity.
Look at the spoken word movement now, you know, which is so sharp and so cool and so interesting, came right out of that. You know, poetry come alive. Yeah, come out of the academy and be here now. Very exciting. Dada, you know, Dada is still a force because it's subversive, and it's not just playful. You know, it can be very in subterranean ways. Almost, I want to say almost abusive, but I don't want to use that in an incorrect way. But what I mean is it can whip us into shape. I'm just using a metaphor here. I don't want to offend anyone, but I think that it's a shock to the system. You know, to see surrealism or Dadaism, to work with dreams, to work with the unconscious, to work with automatic writing, that stuff, you know, is a jolt, and it's of the essence in the arts. Whenever we, you know, lean back as if we were, you know, smoking and think, oh, I'm going to just write a poem today, and to have that charged with some energy from Dada and from surrealism, where you know, it's a wake-up call, and I think we need that. We can't say, oh, that's over, it's too playful, because that stuff was rooted in some really serious interrogation of consciousness.
Well, and I'm thinking too, you were speaking of the spoken word movement. I'm also thinking about the collaborations. And I think this is, I think it's probably time we move over to this area too, because I'm fascinated by this work that you've done. But I'm thinking about the collaborations between Susan Howe and David Grubbs, the albums that the two of them have recorded, in which he provides a sort of sonic space that Susan Howe explores through some of her poetic sequences. I don't know if you've had a chance to.
I don't know that word. That's fascinating. No, I don't know what you're even talking about, but I will look that up. That's, yeah, collaboration. I mean, which is what the press does with its writers. And I'm coming back around to saying thank you again. Is something I've dipped a toe in, in my own poetry. And where would we be without others?
Well, here's the
book, One with Others. That's who we are.
Well, here's the interesting thing, because that too has really been central to my own poetics since I first started writing seriously. And yet it runs counter to so much of the received wisdom. I'm really glad that we have anthologies that have centered collaborative work, because I think for so long that too was taboo, right? That we were meant to be, and I think that this again is a conversation that emerged post-language school. I think the New York poets were doing a phenomenal job of playing seriously like this, but collaboration, right? Collaboration among writers and artists. In the case of Susan Howe and David Grubbs, a poet, a scholar, and a musician. What is it for you? How does it work? And what was the impulse to work with someone else and to share that intimacy, right?
Well, I've collaborated a couple of times. Very early on in my career, I wrote a book with the poet Olga Brumis.
Mm-hmm.
And later I collaborated with the painter Beverly Pepper, painter and sculptor Beverly Pepper, in a different kind of conversation. And both of them were thrilling. The first with Olga was more difficult because I didn't know how to do it. We would write together, and I would think, well, I'm going to let someone into my process. I was really very precious about the whole thing, and that got knocked down like a bunch of bricks. And it was very rewarding to find out that it's not a precious situation here. You can be affected by somebody else and need to be, which taught me a lot about life as well. I was very protective of my writing space.
Yeah.
And she entered it freely and really, really helped me to grow as an artist and as a person. Working with Beverly was quite different because, she was working in a different medium, but we went back and forth many times to make sure that the two worked. In a book called Midnights, obviously, the first metaphor one thinks of is darkness, and she was working in black charcoal. So that right away spoke to what I was doing. Yeah. I would say, I haven't done it enough, especially during this period of COVID. Everyone's been so isolated. It's actually been quite hard to collaborate, except in conversations that might influence work. But actually, my work has been, I think I mentioned earlier, it just came out of my room. Yeah. Seriously, just one area in my room. I mean, I really talk about not going anywhere, just letting my mind wander, and of course, reading a lot. That's a kind of collaboration that I've had all my life. As any reader knows, you are part of a beautiful community when you're reading another person's book, because you're not just reading that person's book, you're reading everyone who influenced that person. Yeah. So it's a very crowded space. And it's not the kind of space you need to worry about, somebody sneezing on you. It's a beautiful closed system, but it's airy. It's wonderful.
Well, and that's one of the things that I will always hold dear from Robert Creeley, was his notion of gathering your company, which I think is just such a beautiful way of speaking to that process of not only finding your canon, but of forging those relationships that are going to continue to influence you throughout the course of your life, right? Because these are conversations that take place. And speaking to your experience collaborating, I had a very similar experience in working with the poet and now the video artist, Kevin McClellan. We were introduced through a collaborative endeavor. We presented at the Ocean State Writers Conference years ago, and the organizer of the event, Peter Covino, put us together, figuring that something would happen. And Kevin and I got to know one another by writing together. And although that had been something that I had been doing for years, this was somebody I hadn't met before, whose work I wasn't familiar with. And to your point, it absolutely transformed my relationship to the writing process, because no longer are you the person who's determining the meaningfulness of each other. We just entered into absolutely uncharted territory and reveled in the unknown together. And I still look to the poems that we wrote as such pleasurable experiences. And I think that gets conveyed in writing that is entered into with that sort of depth of feeling and that experientiality. I really believe that that's communicated. And I think that we find that in both of the books that we've had the good fortune to publish that you've written. You get a sense of lived experience here. And I had the same experience working with the artist Stacy Pritchard, who I don't know if any of you know her work, but if not, that's a bus to hop on as soon as you can. She's doing exquisite work. Same thing, working in different media, but those translations, those conversations, the dislocations that occur are so significant and impactful, because we don't have a choice but to trust the people that we're engaging with, whether they're writers, whether they're fellow readers, whether they're people we're making work with. And I just think that that's such a wonderful opportunity. And I appreciate you spending a little bit of time talking about that. For those of you who have not had a chance to see Jane's collaborative work, please make sure you do so.
Thank you. Thanks for the plug. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I don't want to leave without thanking you personally, Derek, for this conversation. I mean, it's all too rare to be able to talk with somebody who's not only an editor, but also a writer, and who's been so closely involved in what I've done. I can't thank you enough from the bottom of my heart. And everyone else who's participated in the production and who's still making beautiful books long after I'm gone. I'm thanking you for everyone who's on board and everyone who's about to be published. Thank you for the work that you do.
Well, it's much appreciated, and that is absolutely a two-way street. And I'm looking forward to the next book we do 30 years on.
I am as well.
I don't know if there are any questions from anybody who's out yonder, but or I don't even know what time it is, but
we're a minute over currently. But I certainly have some additional time, whether we want to keep the recording going or whether we want to just address some of the questions for attendees. I have a little bit of additional time. I'd love to stick around for a few more minutes, because I know that
I'm happy to do that. If there are any questions out there, I don't want to keep anybody who's, dinner is perking or anything, but please, yeah, anybody who wants to throw something at us, let's just stay a couple minutes and see what happens.
Yeah, so we do actually have a few advanced audience questions. One of them is, what advice do you have for new poets who are just beginning to learn about the craft? And I think that, Jane, some of what you talked about a little bit earlier kind of speaks to this, especially about reading, not only people who are writing those books, but also the people who have influenced those writers as well. So I feel like that's probably a good start.
That's a great answer right there. You gave the answer, read what you are drawn to by reading widely, and don't read anything that you're told to read. If you're a few pages in or halfway in or three, set it down. But if you find someone you love, there's a whole trail behind that person. I Adrienne Rich is somebody I discovered, and then I found Muriel Rukeyser behind Adrienne Rich. And who did Muriel Rukeyser love to read? And on it went, Gwendolyn Brooks, and woo, woo, woo. So it's pretty easy once you bump into something you love. It's like dating, you make a lot of mistakes, and then you, well, you're in love.
Well, and two, I want to say I often use the analogy of the jazz liner note. I think that gets lost when we're speaking to people who aren't record collectors, right? Or don't have a CD collection any longer. But for those of you who know, for those of you who don't, jazz albums in particular were accompanied by liner notes in which a jazz critic, a writer, right? I mean, there are some phenomenal jazz liner notes, but in those jazz liner notes, you'd hear about the album, you'd hear about the players, but you'd also hear about a few other albums, either that they played on or the producer had a hand in, and then suddenly you got 5 more albums. And from those 5 albums, you've got those liner notes. And suddenly, not only are you starting to key in on Miles or Coltrane, but you're starting to key in on, say, Norman Granz, the producer, right? You're starting to key into the pianist Tommy Flanagan, one of my fellow Michiganders. You're starting to learn the players, the history, and suddenly you've got a jazz collection that's inspired by your particular passion. And it's not going to be like anyone else's collection. And so reading, not only reading, but experiencing and making yourself available to experience, I think is profoundly important. Now, that's not to condone bad behavior. And it's not to encourage you to go out and do untoward things, but to be available to experience and to savor the opportunities. And Jane, as you had said at the very start, to encourage a certain slowness in your life when everything around you is moving too damn fast. That's going to open up the possibility for you to find the poem that you're going to write next. And I think that that's one of the things, when you start to follow poems, you're really going to start writing. You're really going to start engaging. And I think that that's one of those pivotal moments. But discovery and being willing to go out into the world and to find your company is incredibly, incredibly important.
Thank you both. Those are really, really great answers.
And just really quickly, I mean, get the books in the series. I'm not just saying that facetiously. Again, I have the great good fortune to serve in a capacity that almost staggers my imagination, because the books in this series are the books that are on that shelf and that have been with me as I have moved around this country to take on teaching positions and to be close to family. These books are transformative books for poets, for writers, and for readers. And it's an incredible, incredible list. So if you haven't explored, just explore and see if there's something here that resonates.
Bravo. Yeah, bravo.
Absolutely.
Have you got another one for us?
We do. We have 2 more. What is the first step for publishing a poetry book?
Finishing it. By which I mean, if you just have a certain number of pages, that won't make a book. It has to really work the way a single poem works. As you know, like if you have a 3-stanza poem, you have a beginning, middle, and an end. The poetry book is another poem that you put together, and it has a rhythm and a timing and a sensibility. So it's not just random pages. And once that's finished, once you've got a sort of arc of intention, I would call it, you're ready to start sending it out. And I would simply send it out to places where I would want to be published. So you have to do quite a bit of reading to see, what books do I love? What press do I love? I would love to be represented. It would be an honor to be represented. That's how my books ended up at the University of Michigan Press. it would be an honor to be there. And here I am. Miracles do happen. I mean, that can happen for anyone who is serious about publishing, to find what you love, what books you admire and respect, and you would feel honored to be with, and send it there. And buck up, because you are going to get rejected. I've got enough to wallpaper several rooms in my home. So yeah, if you can take it, which you can, it's just your ego for, you know, a minute and a half, then you're over it, on to the next poem.
Well, and also too, this was part of our conversation before the event tonight. I think it's, and I'm speaking both as a writer and as an editor, I think it's incredibly important not only to do the research, right? Not only to ready the manuscript, and Jane, I couldn't agree with you more. And I just want to take a moment to thank. So the book that Barrow Street published a couple of years ago, that book wouldn't have happened without the careful stewardship of Claudia Keelan, who helped guide me through that process that you've outlined, Jane, of sequencing a book, because it is a very different experience than just putting poems together, right? You really have to have a sort of architectural sense of composition. It is a very different experience. And so I do want to thank Claudia and Will every opportunity I get, because I didn't see that book in the way that that book was meant to come together. And that is an integral part of putting together a book that is going to get published. The other part of it is, once you are ready to send it out, once you have done that research, even if you do wind up getting a rejection letter, and maybe you want to speak to this, Jane, about your initial botched rejection letter from Michigan that we withdrew, right? But develop relationships, right? Because you just never know where they're going to lead. And I don't mean to do that in a mercenary sense or a careerist sense. I mean, if you find a press that you're passionate about, support that press, create invitations for the editor or the editorial team to connect with you, establish a human relationship with the editor who's serving in that capacity at that time. And again, it's not necessarily going to lead to publication, but it's a wonderful opportunity for you to get additional insight. It's a great opportunity for you to follow up with questions if you do wind up getting a rejection. If you have a relationship with an editor, you can follow up and ask, hey, look, I didn't really get a sense of what I need to do here. Could you provide me with a pointer or two, or can you provide a rationale if the editor or the editorial team hasn't done that? And so establishing those relationships, I think, is also a pivotal component. Not every editor is going to have the time. So again, don't take that personally. But if you have that opportunity, we used to talk about it this way before everything was done online. If you got a rejection with ink on it, in other words, if the editor took time to actually give you a note, hey, this is really good, but we didn't take it, or maybe you want to send it again, send something else to us, then that's a door opening. And that's a door that you want to make sure that you walk through, because that person took the time, they responded to your work, just didn't fit with the issue, maybe didn't fit with the catalog at the moment, but follow that up and stay in touch with those people, right? Again, if we're doing this right, we're building communities as we go, and that's where the strength comes from. You're going to be astonished at the level of support that you find, even in those situations in which a book doesn't go from manuscript to contract, right? So Jane, you had an experience with University of Michigan Press with your first.
Yes, I did. I boldly submitted a manuscript that was pretty quickly roundly rejected. And as I said earlier, I was quite blue. I really wanted to be with the group of people who were publishing there. And I just hung my head for a couple of weeks and miraculously got a letter from the editor, Donald Hall, saying that there must have been some mistake, that he loved my work, and miracles happen. Yeah, so he saw it to press, and it was amazing. That doesn't always happen. There are many dark stories I could tell, but we're running out of time. But that was an exception, not the rule. And I would just add to the beautiful thing that you said, Derek. People shouldn't be afraid to go it alone. If you have difficulty making a community, it will happen over time. Don't be impatient. Writing is a solitary art. You have to steel yourself for it. It's lonely. Being an artist is a lonely, beautiful thing. It's like being alive twice.
Yeah.
Very well said. We have one more question. This one came in through the Q&A on Zoom. This person wrote, I am currently teaching poetry to 9th graders. I have seen joy in their eyes as they experience writing their feelings and thoughts. As a poet/writer, what would be the most important lesson students should walk away with?
Freedom. Feel free to write anything you want. A short piece, a long piece, a piece that makes no sense. No rules. Let yourself go. Write down no self-censorship.
And I would add to that, your voice matters. And I think that again, to me, just in terms of speaking to the work that I'm doing in an editorial capacity here, I can't stress that enough. Your voice matters, and particularly at that point, right? I want to thank the teacher who's in the trenches, because this is an extremely, extremely difficult time to be an educator here in the United States. I want to thank you for your commitment to poetry and the arts. And I just want to say I celebrate the work that you're doing. And as a longtime educator myself, there's nothing like those moments. There's absolutely nothing like those moments where you see young people beginning to recognize the power of language and the power of their voice and the opportunities that they have to, through creative expression, make change happen. So keep at it. And I can't thank you enough, because that work is absolutely instrumental in creating a future for this world.
We love you. We love you. Whoever you are, we love you. Thank you.
All right. I think that wraps up for this evening. Thanks everybody for sticking around. Yeah, and thank you very much, Derek and Jane, for such a fantastic conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot as well. We will be posting a recording of this event to YouTube, which will be released later this week. During the month of April, which is also National Poetry Month, you can also take 40% off of all books in the Poets on Poetry series using the discount code UMPOP on our website. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here.